ශ්‍රී ලංකාවට ලබා දෙන IMF ණය වාරිකයේ පළමු සමාලෝචනය මේ දිනවල සිදුවනවා. IMF දූත මණ්ඩල කණ්ඩායමක් මේ දිනවල ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ සංචාරය කරනවා. ඔවුන් මෙරට සිවිල් සංවිධාන, විපක්ෂීය කණ්ඩායම් සහ ජනාධිපතිවරයා හමු වුණා. ඔවුන් මේ වන විට ශ්‍රී ලංකා මහ බැංකු මූලස්ථාන පරිශ්‍රයේ ප්‍රවෘත්ති සාකච්ඡාවකට එක්ව සිටිනවා. අපි සූදානම් එහි සජීව දර්ශන වෙත දැන් යොමු වන්නට.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IMF's press briefing on the first review mission under the Extended Fund Facility Arrangement for Sri Lanka. My name is Huang Lan Pinky Vu. I'm a communications officer at the IMF. And today I'm delighted to be joined by three speakers. Peter Brewer, Senior Mission Chief for Sri Lanka. Kasyarina Srizenka, Deputy Mission Chief for Sri Lanka, and Sawat Jahan, Resident Representative in Colombo. By now, I think you should have seen the press release that we just posted on our website, and I hope that you had some time to digest the details. To begin, I will invite Peter to give some opening remarks, and then we will open the floor for questions. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our press briefing here this afternoon. It's good to be back in Colombo and see you all. As you already know, the IMF team has been here since September 14th to conduct the first review under the Extended Fund Facility, EFF, arrangement here in Sri Lanka. During this time, we've held constructive and productive discussions with the authorities and other stakeholders, including the private sector and civil society organizations. The people of Sri Lanka have shown remarkable resilience in the face of enormous challenges. Sri Lanka has made commendable progress in implementing difficult but much needed reforms. These efforts are bearing fruit as the economy is showing tentative signs of stabilization. Inflation is down from a peak of 70% to today 1.3%, and gross international reserves increased by $1.5 billion between March and June this year, and shortages of essentials have eased. But full economic recovery is not yet assured. Growth momentum remains subdued, with real GDP contracting 3.1% in the second quarter this year on a year-on-year basis, and high-frequency economic indicators still sending mixed signals. Reserve accumulation has slowed in recent months. In this challenging environment, the authorities have undertaken important steps on monetary and fiscal policies, as well as implemented structural reforms to address the ongoing economic crisis. The government has met the program's primary balance targets and remains committed to this important pillar of the program to support their efforts to restore debt sustainability. Key legislations have passed in Parliament, including the Central Bank Act and the Anti-Corruption Act. And these could improve governance if implemented effectively. The IMF Governance Diagnostic Report would inform future reform measures to strengthen governance when published. A new welfare benefit payment scheme was enacted with new eligibility criteria that aim to improve targeting, adequacy, and coverage of social safety nets. To ensure financial stability, steps were taken on conducting bank diagnostics, developing a roadmap for addressing banking system capital and liquidity shortfalls, and improving the bank resolution framework. The authorities have also made headway in regaining debt sustainability through the execution of domestic debt restructuring and with advancing discussions with external creditors. More work still needs to be done to sustain the reform momentum and put the economy on a path towards lasting recovery and economic growth. For instance, revenue mobilization gains, while improved relative to last year, are expected to fall short of initial projections by nearly 15% by year end, in part due to economic factors. To increase revenues and signal better governance, it will be important to strengthen tax administration, remove tax exemptions, and actively eliminate tax evasion. Discussions are ongoing, and the authorities are continuing to make progress on their plans for revenue mobilization targets, anti-corruption efforts, and other important structural reforms. Let me conclude by thanking the authorities for the excellent collaboration during the mission. The team will continue its discussions in the context of the first review with the goal of reaching a staff-level agreement in the near term. We reiterate our commitment to providing support to Sri Lanka during this challenging time. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Now we will open the floor for questions. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll
from News First. Mr. Brewer, my question to you is, have you mentioned that the IMF is unsatisfied with the government of Sri Lanka's tax collection
opinion about the situation for the poor? That was one of the conditions of the IMF.
I think we'll get one more question. Marwan?
Yeah, Marwan Makar make references to the executive board review subject to adequate progress on finance reviews. This means bilateral discussions with external creditors. The president is due to go to China next month, hopefully to win Chinese support for debt restructuring. What if these delays continue, and how would that delay impact Sri Lanka's economic recovery? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll take this first patch.
Thank you for these questions. So, as I mentioned, as we mentioned in the press release, tax collection is a concern in Sri Lanka. It's an important pillar of the program because it's important to sustain the essential expenditures of the government. The government provides important services, education, health, infrastructure, support for the poor and vulnerable, and these expenditures need to be sustained with an appropriate amount of revenues. In Sri Lanka, there's a big gap between these two. Expenditures are of the order of 19% or so of GDP. Revenue is in the order of 9% of GDP or so, and that gap needs to be filled. To accomplish that objective, it's important to have appropriate tax policies and tax administration systems in place that support this effort. The reforms in this regard already started last year with significant tax policy reforms that essentially reversed some of the large tax cuts that had taken place in 2019. But that by itself isn't enough for Sri Lanka to bridge that gap that I mentioned and to step away from being one of the countries with the lowest tax takes in the entire world. And so discussions in that regard continue to ensure that the objectives of the program can be reached. And you remember that the objective is for in 2024 for Sri Lanka to be able to raise revenue equivalent to 12% of GDP. So there's some way to go to get there next year. Maybe let me also take the question on the debt, and then perhaps Sabit can speak to the second question. So this question was about the financing reviews and engagement with external creditors. So for the IMF program to move to the next step of completing the first review and dispersing the second tranche, two important components are needed. One is to agree with the authorities on a set of policies that they can take forward, reach staff level agreement for this first review, and we are very confident that we will be able to do that with a little bit more time to continue the discussions. And then the second leg that needs to be completed is the discussions on the debt. And essentially what we need is a clear path towards restoring debt sustainability. For the IMF to be able to go ahead, it needs to convince itself that debt sustainability can be restored, and to do that, we need to convince ourselves that there are discussions, negotiations that will result in debt treatments that will essentially be in line with the debt targets that we had set at the beginning of the program in March. When these debt targets can be reached, that is when we assess that debt sustainability can be restored. And so we need to convince ourselves of the path to that direction. Over to Sabit.
On the question regarding the situation of the poor, I have been in Sri Lanka now for almost a year, and I've witnessed all Sri Lankans, especially the poor and the vulnerable. And it's oftentimes it is the poor and the vulnerable group that do not have the buffers to go through this crisis. How the IMF program can help? Well, we can help through multiple ways. First is when there is economic stabilization in the economy, that means that it's good for all Sri Lankans, including the poor and the vulnerable, because this means that inflation will go down as it has been during the first 6 months of the program, and therefore this helps the poor, as we know, because inflation is the worst form of tax. It also helps through reduced interest rates, and we have seen interest rates also coming down. And then the program that the IMF has designed, the tax that is in place is actually quite progressive. So the poor and the vulnerable are excluded from it. Only those who are able to pay do pay. But in addition to this, the one point that I would like to highlight is the IMF program places a lot of importance on social spending. In fact, this is one of the core pillars of the program. Under the program for 2023, we had discussed with the authorities to have a spending floor on 4 major cash transfers, which would be about 187 billion rupees, or equivalent to 0.6% of GDP. And going forward, we'd like to see this minimum social spending to continue into the next year.
Thank you.
Intika Saklasuri from the Daily Mirror. As revenue mobilization remains a concern, So in your discussions with the authorities, how satisfied are you with the plans that they have to address the situation? That's question number one. And the other one is SOE restructuring. Are you happy with the pace at which that is happening at the moment?
Sisira Kannangal from Madaderana. My question is there any opportunity to reconsider this agreement?
Which agreement?
IMF, between government and IMF, because optionally they're always asking for renegotiate the agreement between IMF.
Okay, one more question over there.
Shiharan is from Economy Next. The government has already announced its DDO, domestic debt optimization. Are you satisfied with it, and do you think EPF alone is enough, or do you think they need to go for banking sector as well in the DDO? That's my first question. Second question, when is likely to the second tranche be disbursed if everything goes well?
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Revenue mobilization. So as I mentioned, there has been a strong effort already. Considerable reforms have been introduced. But at the same time, unfortunately, there is going to be a shortfall this year. There are big factors because, as I mentioned, growth is a tad lower than was projected, and as inflation is significantly less, and the exchange rate is a little bit different. So there's a whole host of factors that explain some of the shortfall. But there's also a lot more to be done in terms of continuing with the reform path and also tax administration. So that really is the area where the discussions are focused on, so as to reach the objective of 12% of GDP revenue by the end of next year, and avoid a shortfall next year. So we're really looking to the benefits of the tax reforms that were introduced last year to bear full fruit and to be supplemented with appropriate additional reforms. So SOE, maybe you can do in a second. With respect to can the agreement reconsidered or renegotiated? In principle, that's possible. It's of course a big undertaking, and indeed. We would want to be sure that the objectives of the program can still be achieved. But it does happen that there are little changes to the program where the same objectives can be achieved in different ways. Indeed, this is sort of what we do on an ongoing basis. For example, during this review, make sure that the policies that were agreed at the beginning are still the appropriate policies, or do adjustments need to be made as we go along. So in a way, programs are dynamic and do that all the time anyway. And then maybe connected to that is the question on the second tranche. So there is no fixed timeline. As I mentioned, we need two important things to be satisfied. We need to have reached agreement on a set of policies and reforms that will allow us to go forward with the understanding that the objectives of the program can be reached. So now we've discovered there was a little bit of a shortfall in one area during this year, so we're looking to try and find ways to address that shortfall and compensate for it. And so working in a direction of having agreement on these policies is one important prerequisite. And then the other one is in the area of debt. Is there a stable path towards debt sustainability, reaching agreements with creditors that will help restore debt sustainability in Sri Lanka. And so when these two conditions are met, we can go forward. Of course, there's a little bit of an administrative process also. It takes us some time to write the report that actually assesses, performance for the first review. That's a report that goes through various steps before it's considered by our executive board, which will make the final decision on this, and then finally publish that report and share it with the public. Then there's a question on the domestic debt restructuring and sort of excuse me, the various elements of it in the country. So from the IMF's perspective, what matters to us is that the debt targets can be reached. Remember, these are the targets with respect to the debt stock and with respect to the flow of debt, the gross financing needs, the debt service on the external side, and also the debt relief that's needed within the program period. The government, together with their financial and legal advisors, then has to think about how to reach that objective. How can we ask the various creditors to offer relief to us, the government, so that we can comply with these objectives. Now, within that, so the government has chosen a particular way, and as you said, the banks are not in there. Now, I should say we care about the targets, but we also care to some extent how we get there, in the sense that it's important for us to maintain financial and social stability. Because otherwise the problem could just become worse, and then these targets don't apply anymore. So here in Sri Lanka, I think financial stability is maintained. The banks will nevertheless suffer from the restructuring through their exposure to the government through domestic foreign exchange instruments, as well as external foreign exchange instruments. Which is why also financial stability is an important part of the program with its own pillar. But let me stop there. I've spoken quite a bit, and Katja can speak about the SOEs.
So on the SOE reform, the objective of the SOE reform is to ensure that SOEs are run on a commercial basis and that they do not accumulate any more additional financial liabilities for the government. So in this area, the authorities are making good progress. For example, they introduced adjustments to the fuel and electricity prices to ensure that SOEs do not accumulate additional losses. And also, in the summer, the Cabinet approved a comprehensive strategy to address the cross-holdings of debt across the various SOEs, and these are both steps in the right direction.
Ma'am, if I may, a quick follow-up question.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is now relating to what Mr. Brewer said earlier as well. Now, there has been a huge exodus of professionals in Sri Lanka, as you would have noticed, and alongside that, a lot of people, citizens of Sri Lanka, have found it very difficult to handle the tax burden that has been going on because of the reforms. Of course, understandable. However, you also mentioned, Mr. Brewer, that there has been a gap within the government revenue and the government expenses. With that, do you think that we can expect tax reforms in the very near future?
Yeah, maybe one more over there, and then we'll close.
Mr. Brewer, can you explain to us what exactly do you mean by progress on this external debt? Has Paris Club and China, everybody got to give some undertaking, or is it partially, or what? And the foreign credit, the private creditors are also there. What is the progress that is needed before the? Yeah, no. What is the exact progress that you think should be made on the external debt front? Is it Paris Club only? Is China needed? Is the private creditors also needed? Do you have to finalize it, or is it some interim thing that you have to do? What do you have to do?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, filling the gap of missing tax revenues does mean some reforms are needed in order to increase the tax take. We are fully cognizant of the cost that this implies for the population, and indeed, it's not only the taxes, right? It's also utility prices. Inflation has left prices very high. The population is affected in so many different ways, and it is, a very, very burdensome for the average citizen of the country. Essentially, the country is now sort of experiencing the consequences of both policies and shocks that happened in Sri Lanka over the past so many years. These are policies that left the country very vulnerable. In particular, a very strong tax cut in 2019, which the effects of which were then exacerbated by various shocks in the country. So all this culminated in the crisis that was at its depth in the summer last year when we were here also, and so essentially the population is now being asked to help cover the costs, and that is very burdensome, and I understand that. On the question of the what's needed on the debt, so really what we need is, so we conduct something called financing assurances review. This is a process that we have that applies in the case of Sri Lanka to both official creditors, meaning other countries that have lent to Sri Lanka on a bilateral basis, as well as commercial creditors, for example, bondholders. And as you know, the government is in discussions with all of these groups. In Sri Lanka's case, the debt is spread around quite a bit, externally and domestically. And so what we look for in order to be able to move forward in this debt restructuring case is adequate progress in the negotiations with the creditors that would give us confidence that this process will be concluded in a timely manner and in line with the program's debt targets. So that's really what we're looking for, and it is the Executive Board's decision at the end of whether and when the IMF will be able to move ahead.
Thank you very much. We have come to the end of our press briefing today, and please note that the recording and transcript will be posted on imf.org very soon. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ සංචාරය කරන IMF දූත මණ්ඩලයයි මේ මාධ්‍ය හමුවට එක්ුණේ ශ්‍රී ලංකා මහ බැංකුව පරිශ්‍රයේදී මෙහිදී ඔවුන් පැහැදිලි කිරීමක් කරනු ලැබුවා. පළමුව ඉන් අනතුරුව මාධ්‍යවේදීන්ට අවශ්‍ය ගැටලු මතු කිරීම සඳහා අවස්ථාව ලබා දුන්නා. එම ගැටලු වලට IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය පිළිතුරු ලබා දුන්නා. ඔවුන් සඳහන් කළ ප්‍රකාශයේ ඒ වගේම මාධ්‍යවේදීන්ට ලබා දුන් පිළිතුරු සම්බන්ධයෙන් සාරාංශගත කිරීමක් කළොත් විශේෂයෙන් මේ IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය සඳහන් කළේ මේ වන විට ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ විදේශ සංචිත බිලියන 1.5ක් දක්වා වැඩි වී තිබෙන බව, උද්දමනය සැලකිය යුතු ලෙස පහත වැටි ඇති බව තමයි සඳහන් කළේ. ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ ජනතාව ආර්ථික අවපාතයෙන් ගොඩ එන්න කර ඇති කැපකිරීම අද්විතීය බව IMF නියෝජිතයින් සඳහන් කරනවා. මේ අභියෝග වලින් ජය ගන්න ආණ්ඩුව ප්‍රශංසනීය පියවර අරන් තිබෙන බවත් දූත මණ්ඩලය සඳහන් කර සිටිනවා. අයවැය හා මූල්‍ය ප්‍රතිපත්ති වලට අදාළවයි එම කරුණු සඳහන් කළේ. ඒ වගේම දූෂණ මැඩලීමට ආණ්ඩුව තබා තිබෙන පියවර යහපත් ප්‍රතිඵල ඉදිරියේදී දැකගත හැකි බව තමයි IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය සඳහන් කළේ. මූල්‍ය ස්ථාවරභාවය ඇති කරගන්නට බැංකු පද්ධතිය සහ ඊට අදාළ නීති රීති හැඩගස්වා ගත යුතුව තිබෙන බව සඳහන් කළා. පසුගිය වසරට සාපේක්ෂව ආණ්ඩුවේ ආදායම් රැස්කිරීමේ ප්‍රගතියක් ඇති බවයි IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය පෙන්වා දෙන්නේ. බදු සහන ලබා දීම හා බදු පැහැර හැරීම හමාර කළ යුතුව ඇති බවයි ඔවුන්ගේ අදහස. මෙම පළමු ප්‍රගති සමාලෝචනයේදී ආණ්ඩුවේ නියෝජිතයින් IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය සමග කටයුතු කළ ආකාරය පිළිබඳව කෘතඥතාව පළ කළා. බදු රැස්කිරීම වැදගත්ම කොටසක් ලෙස IMF වැඩසටහනේ ඇති බව තමයි ඔවුන් සඳහන් කළේ. එසේ කළහොත් පමණක් ආණ්ඩුවට වියදම් දරා ගැනීමට හැකි බවත් ආදායම් හා වියදම් අතර විශාල පරතරයක් තිබෙන බවත් තමයි IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය පෙන්වා දෙන්නේ. ඒ නිසා බදු කළමනාකරණය හා බදු එකතු කිරීමේ යාන්ත්‍රණය ශක්තිමත් කර ගැනීමේ අවශ්‍යතාවය IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය පෙන්වා දෙනවා. විශේෂයෙන් ඔවුන් සඳහන් කරන්නේ 2019 වසරේ සිට විශාල බදු කපා හැරීමක් ශ්‍රී ලංකා ආණ්ඩුව විසින් කර ඇති බවයි. විශේෂයෙන් 2024 දී දළදේශීය නිෂ්පාදිතයේ ප්‍රතිශතයක් ලෙස 12% දක්වා බදු ආදායම ගෙන ඒමට හැකිවනු ඇති බව තමයි IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය පෙන්වා දෙන්නේ. මාර්තු මාසයේ IMF යෝජනා කළ ණය ඉලක්ක වෙත යා යුතුව තිබෙන බව තමයි සඳහන් කළේ. මෙම IMF වැඩසටහන සකසා තිබෙන්නේ බදු ගෙවිය යුතු අයගෙන් බදු අය කර ගැනීම සඳහා බව තමයි ඔවුන් සඳහන් කළේ. ප්‍රතිවිභාගතකරණයට අදාළව සෑම ඉලක්කයක්ම සපුරා නැති බවත් මෙහිදී පෙන්වා දුන්නා. ඒ අනුව IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ කළ සෑම සාකච්ඡාවකදීම අවධානය යොමු කළේ එම ඉලක්ක සපුරා ගැනීමට ගත යුතු පියවර පිළිබඳව බව IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය සඳහන් කළා. IMF ගිවිසුම් සංශෝධනය සම්බන්ධයෙන් මතු කළ ප්‍රශ්නවලට පිළිතුරු දෙමින් සඳහන් කළේ ගිවිසුම් සංශෝධනය සම්බන්ධයෙන් ගැටලුවක් නැහැ. ඉලක්ක වලට යාමට විවිධ ක්‍රම ඇති බව තමයි ඔවුන් පෙන්වා දුන්නේ. දෙවන වාරිකය මුදා හැරීමට නිශ්චිත කාලරාමුවක් නොමැති බව සඳහන් කළා. එකඟ වෙලා තිබෙන ඉලක්ක ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන ආකාරය අනුව IMF වැඩසටහන ඉදිරියට ගෙන යා හැකි බව තමයි මේ නියෝජිත පිරිස සඳහන් කළේ. ණය හිමියන් සමග එකඟතා ඇති කර ගැනීම ඉතාම වැදගත් බවයි පෙන්වා දුන්නේ. පළමුවෙනි සමාලෝචනයට අදාළ වාර්තාව පිටවිය යුතු බවත් එම වාර්තාව මහජනයා අතරට යන එකක් බවත් IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය සඳහන් කළා. ආණ්ඩුව මූල්‍ය කටයුතු සම්බන්ධයෙන් විශේෂඥයින්ගේ අදහස් ලබාගෙන නිවැරදි තීරණ වලට පැමිණිය යුතු බවයි IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය සඳහන් කළේ. කාංජතෙල් හා විදුලිය සම්බන්ධයෙන් හඳුන්වා දී ඇති ගාස්තු ක්‍රමය ආණ්ඩුව හරි තීරණ ගැනීමට පටන්ගෙන ඇති බවට හොඳ උදාහරණයක් බව තමයි IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය පෙන්වා දෙන්නේ. මෙය ජනතාවට මේ අවස්ථාවේ ජනතාව පීඩාවට පත්ව ඉන්නේ බදු ප්‍රතිපත්තිය නිසාම පමණක් නොවන බව තමයි IMF නියෝජිත කණ්ඩායමේ අදහස. අත්‍යවශ්‍ය දේවල් වල මිල ඉහළ යාම නිසා ජනතාව පීඩාවකට පත්ව සිටින බව දන්නා බවත් IMF නියෝජිත මණ්ඩලය පවසනවා. ඔවුන් සඳහන් කරන්නේ මේ තත්ත්වය ඇති වුණේ ආණ්ඩුවේ ප්‍රතිපත්ති තීරණ නිසා බව. විශේෂයෙන් මෙවැනි දෙයක් ඇතිව තිබෙන්නේ විශේෂයෙන් 2019 කළ බදු කපා හැරීම නිසා බව තමයි IMF දූත මණ්ඩලය මෙම මාධ්‍ය හමුවට එක් වෙමින් ඔවුන්ගේ පැහැදිලි කිරීම සහ මාධ්‍යවේදීන්ගේ ප්‍රශ්න වලට පිළිතුරු දෙමින් සඳහන් කළේ. මේ තමයි මේ විනාඩි 25කට ආසන්න කාලයක් පැවති මෙම මාධ්‍ය හමුවේ සාරාංශගත කිරීම. අපි සූදානමින් ඉන්නවා රාත්‍රී 7 ප්‍රධාන ප්‍රවෘත්ති ප්‍රකාශයෙන් ඉතාම සවිස්තරව මේ පිළිබඳව තොරතුරු වාර්තා කරන්නට. ජෙෆ්රි
ஸ்துதி வசந்த விசிட செய்தியூடாக உங்களை சந்திக்கிறோம். இலங்கைக்கான நீடிக்கப்பட்ட நிதி கடன் வசதி தொடர்பான முதலாவது மீளாய்வு குறித்து கலந்துரையாடுவதற்காக சர்வதேச நாணய நிதியத்தின் பிரதிநிதிகள் குழு இன்றைய தினம் கொழும்பில் கூடி விசேட ஊடகவியலாளர் சந்திப்பு ஒன்றை முன்னெடுத்திருந்தது. இந்த கலந்துரையாடலில் இலங்கைக்கான சிரேஷ்ட தூதுவர் பீட்டர் ப்ரூயர் கருத்து வெளியிட்டிருந்தார். அதனுடைய சாராம்சம், அதாவது இலங்கை பாரிய சவால்களுக்கு முகம் கொடுக்கும் வகையில் இலங்கை மக்கள் குறிப்பிடத்தக்க மீட்சியை தற்போது வெளிப்படுத்தியுள்ளதாக அவர் குறிப்பிட்டிருந்தார். பணவீக்கம் செப்டம்பர் மாதம் 2022 உச்சமாக இருந்த 70 வீதத்திலிருந்து 2023 செப்டம்பர் 2% கீழே குறைந்துள்ளதாக அவர் குறிப்பிட்டிருந்தார். இந்த ஆண்டு மார்ச் ஜூன் காலத்தில் மொத்த சர்வதேச கையிருப்பு 1.5 பில்லியனாக அதிகரித்துள்ளதாகவும் அவர் குறிப்பிட்டிருந்தார். அதேபோன்று அத்தியாவசிய பொருட்களின் பற்றாக்குறையும் தற்போது குறைந்துள்ளதாக அவர் குறிப்பிட்டிருந்தார். முழுமையான பொருளாதார மீட்சி இன்னும் உறுதி செய்யப்படவில்லை என்றும் குறிப்பிட்டிருந்தார். அதேபோன்று வரி தொடர்பாக பேசும்போது வரி அறவிடுவதன் மூலமே அரசாங்கத்தின் செலவினங்களை ஈடு செய்து கொள்ள முடியும் என்று அவர் குறிப்பிட்டிருந்தார். எனவே வரி முகாமைத்துவம் வரி அறவிடுதலை பலப்படுத்திக் கொள்ள வேண்டும் என்று அவர் குறிப்பிட்டிருந்தார். அதேபோன்று இலங்கையில் வரி அறவிடுதல் முக்கிய விடயம். இலங்கையில் வருமானத்துக்கும் வரி வருமானத்துக்கும் இடையில் பாரிய இடைவெளி இருப்பதாகவும் அந்த இடைவெளியை நிரப்ப வேண்டும் எனவும் அவர் குறிப்பிட்டிருந்தார். இது தொடர்பான விரிவான தகவல்களை நியூஸ் ஃபர்ஸ்ட் இரவு 8 மணி பிரதான செய்திகளில் எதிர்பாருங்கள்.
Thank you, Asantha. Now, what we just took a look at was an in-person press briefing at the Central Bank of Sri Lanka of the International Monetary Team that is currently in Colombo to discuss the first review of the extended fund facility arrangement for Sri Lanka. Taking a look at a few key takeaways from this press briefing, Senior Mission Chief of IMF for Sri Lanka, Peter Brewer, said that Sri Lanka has made commendable progress in implementing difficult but much needed reforms, and he says that these efforts are bearing fruit as the economy is showing tentative signs of stabilization. However, he said that despite early signs of stabilization, full economic recovery has not been assured yet. He also said the discussions are ongoing and the authorities are continuing to make progress on their plans for revenue mobilization targets, anti-corruption efforts and other important structural reforms. He also spoke on tax reforms in the country. He said that tax collection is an important pillar of the program and these expenditures need to be sustained. He said that in Sri Lanka there is a very big gap between revenue and income taxes. He also said that there are two very important prerequisites. One is that authorities must agree with the policies, and he also said that discussions on maintaining a very clear debt sustainability path is important. Also responding to a journalist on the question on when this second tranche will be released, he said that there is no fixed timeline for the second tranche of the first review of the extended fund facility to be released. These are the key takeaways from the press conference that just happened at the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. A more comprehensive report on this press conference and the IMF visit in Sri Lanka will be coming up on our primetime news bulletin tonight.